Imagine you are standing in a small room. The light is dim through the old curtains, and on the wall is a family photo that has faded with time. 3 children sit side by side, their face is gentle, their eyes peaceful. But the longer you look, the more you feel something is wrong. An unnatural quiet, an indescribable chill creeps into the frame. That photo, thought to be just a memory of the Whitman family in 1878, becomes the key to unlocking one of the most haunting stories about love loss and human pain in the face of death. When Dr. Eleanor Morrison found the photo in an old archive, she had no idea that she was about to touch a secret buried for more than a century. Before we begin, where are you watching from? A dark room, a telephone on the table, or perhaps you are lying in the dark waiting for sleep. Wherever you are, take a deep breath because tonight's story might make you not look at old photos the same way again. In the quiet archives of the Iowa State Historical Society, among shelves of fading memories and dust-covered glass plates, photographic historian Dr. Helen Morrison stumbled upon an image that would haunt her thoughts for years to come. It was a portrait dated September of 1878, showing 3 children from what seemed to be a prosperous farming family, posed in the dignified stillness so common in rural American photography of the late 19th century. The handwritten label on the back read, "The Whitman children, Mary, age 12, Samuel, age 9, and little Emma, age 6. September 15th, 1878. In the image, Mary stood behind her siblings, a protective hand resting gently on Samuel's shoulder. Samuel sat solemnly at the center, his young face captured in the serious stillness expected of children during the long photographic exposures of that era. And beside him sat Emma, the youngest, her tiny hands folded neatly in her lap. The backdrop was a familiar one, the front parlor of a well-kept farmhouse. Lace curtains softened the light. The family's best furniture had been carefully arranged for the occasion. Each child was dressed in their finest. Maury in dark wool, trimmed with white lace, Samuel in a smart suit with short trousers, and Emma in a delicately embroidered white dress that spoke quietly of comfort and pride. At first glance, the portrait was entirely ordinary. Just another cherished family keepsake from the prairie. But as Dr. Morrison leaned closer beneath the soft lamplight, unease began to settle in her chest. Something wasn't right. The light across the children's faces was uneven, as though one of them was lit from a different world. Mary and Samuel appeared naturally posed, but Emma seemed carefully arranged. Her stillness was different too, perfect, too complete. Unlike her siblings, her image showed no trace of the faint blur that long exposures usually left on restless children. Her expression was peaceful, far too peaceful. And then there were her eyes, open, directed at the camera, yet somehow distant. They held no spark of movement, only a still serenity that Dr. Morrison couldn't quite name, but could not forget. Turning the photograph over, she found a line of faint, elegant handwriting. In loving memory of our dear children. The Whitman family, Cedar County, Iowa. In loving memory. Those words froze her hand in place. Such phrases were not used for the living. They belonged to mourning to memorial photography. But all 3 children in the image appeared alive and whole. Perplexed and unsettled, Dr. Morrison began to dig deeper. Her search led her into the quiet, heartbreaking world of 19th century family photography, a world where life and death were never far apart. In 1878, rural Iowa was the beating heart of America's growing farmland, a place of abundance, yet shadowed by fragility. Families worked the rich prairie soil and built thriving communities, but life was never secure. Medical care was scarce. Winters were cruel, and invisible killers, diphtheria, scarlet fever, typhoid whooping cough swept through homes like whispered curses. 1 in 4 children never reached their 5th birthday. Those who did were considered a blessing. And so families found ways, tender, desperate ways, to preserve the memory of those they lost. But could that be what the Whitmans had done? Could one of those children, or perhaps all 3, have already crossed that quiet threshold between life and death before the shutter closed? That September afternoon, Dr. Morrison wasn't sure. But the deeper she looked into the photograph, the more the eyes of little Emma seemed to look back. Life on the Iowa prairie demanded a strange kind of strength, one that required families not only to endure loss, but to find ways to live with it. Death came so often and so quietly that it wove itself into the fabric of daily life. To us today, many of their customs might seem unsettling, perhaps even morbid. But in the 19th century, they were simply part of loving, of remembering. One of the most intimate of these customs was the memorial portrait, a photograph meant not for celebration but for farewell. It was a way to hold on to a face that would soon fade from memory. As Dr. Morrison's research deepened, she discovered that by the 1870s, post-mortem photography had become a well-established tradition across rural America. In those isolated communities, it was often the only opportunity a family would ever have to capture the likeness of a loved one. Traveling photographers moved from town to town, carrying their heavy cameras and fragile glass plates, offering their services to record both the living and the recently departed. Some families would summon a photographer within hours of death. Others days later, when the body could still be gently arranged. It was a delicate art. Through careful lighting, precise posing, and even subtle retouching, adding warmth to cheeks or a faint rose to lips, these photographers could make death look like sleep. The goal was not to deceive, but to comfort. To imagine, just for a moment, that the person was still resting among them. And that perhaps was what made the Whitman portrait so extraordinary. It appeared to be both a family portrait and a memorial image, a blending of the living and the dead within a single frame. Such an undertaking, Dr. Morrison learned, was not impossible in 1878, but it was rare and technically demanding. To understand how such an image could exist, she sought help from Dr. James Peterson, a specialist in 19th century photographic methods. Together, they began to piece together how a photographer of that era might have united life and death so seamlessly in one haunting image. The techniques were remarkable and tender. Composite memorial portraits, as they were called, demanded not only mastery of the camera, but deep compassion. Using multiple glass plate negatives, a photographer could combine exposures taken at different times, perhaps days apart, into one harmonious image. Light perspective and shadows had to be aligned perfectly, so that the result appeared natural, even peaceful. A portrait of the living family might be taken first. Later, the image of the deceased would be incorporated, their form posed with hidden supports, their clothing arranged to soften the stiffness of death. In some cases, The photographer would even paint open eyes onto the finished print, creating the illusion of quiet awareness. When Dr. Peterson examined the Whitman photograph closely, the clues began to emerge. The light on Emma's face came from a slightly different direction than that on her siblings. The depth of focus surrounding her figure seemed subtly detached from the rest of the scene. And most striking of all was her perfect stillness. Not the obedient stillness of a child told to behave, but the absolute stillness of one who could not move again. To a trained eye, it was unmistakable. Little Emma had likely already passed away when that photograph was taken. The Whitman family's photographer, whose name sadly has been lost to time, had possessed both extraordinary technical skill and a deep, quiet empathy. Through his craft, he had reunited 3 children who would never again be together in life, creating one final image of wholeness for parents who could not bear the emptiness left behind. What had once seemed a simple portrait now revealed itself to be something else entirely, a work of memorial art, where invention and mourning met in the tender hands of a Victorian photographer. With this new understanding, Dr. Morrison began to trace the Whitman story beyond the image. She turned to census books, land deeds, and fading ink in the Cedar County archives. And there, between lines of bureaucratic handwriting, the outlines of a family began to emerge. The 1870 census listed Jonathan Whitman, age 45, a veteran of the Civil War, his wife Sarah, 38, and their children, Mary Samuel and little Emma. Living with them was Jonathan's aging father, who still helped work the family's 160-acre farm. Records showed that Jonathan had purchased the land in 1865, not long after returning from the war, determined to build a quiet life for his family among the endless fields of Iowa grain. It was a modest life built on hope and hard work, the kind that could be shattered by a single turn of fate. And soon Dr. Morrison would discover just what that fate had been. The Whitmans had once been a picture of quiet success on the Iowa prairie. Over the years, their farm had flourished acres of fertile land, stretching wider each season until they were able to build a fine 2-story farmhouse, one that neighbors often described as the grandest home in Liberty Township. But behind its whitewashed walls, a tragedy was waiting. Dr. Morrison's careful digging through courthouse ledgers and brittle newspaper pages revealed what had happened during that fateful summer of 1878. Cedar County death records showed a name written in delicate ink: Emma Whitman, age 6 years and 4 months. Died August 23, 1878. The cause of death was listed simply as fever. In those days, that single word carried 1,000 unknowns. Diphtheria, typhoid, dysentery, each capable of sweeping through homes and leaving heartbreak in its wake. A faded column in the Cedar Rapids Gazette added a quiet echo to that loss. The community mourns the passing of little Emma Whitman, beloved daughter of Jonathan and Sarah Whitman of Liberty Township, who passed to her eternal rest after a brief but severe illness. The child was known for her sweet disposition and bright intelligence. The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of a family's world falling apart. That summer had been cruel across eastern Iowa. Local doctors spoke of a mysterious summer fever, likely typhoid or dysentery, that had struck without mercy, claiming the lives of children from nearly every township. Isolated farms and primitive medical care meant that once illness entered a household, it rarely left without taking someone with it. The timing of Emma's death in late August and the date of the Whitman portrait, mid-September, drew a grim but tender line between grief and remembrance. It seemed clear that the family had chosen to commission the photograph not as a celebration but as an act of mourning. To hire a professional for such work would have been costly, especially for farmers. Yet the Whitmans spared no expense. Their choice spoke not of vanity but of love, of parents unable to bear the thought of their youngest child fading from view. Through further research, Dr. Morrison finally uncovered the name of the man behind the haunting image, Albert Mueller, a German immigrant whose reputation for sensitivity and technical brilliance had made him one of Iowa's most sought-after photographers of the dead. Mueller had come to Iowa in 1867, bringing with him not only European training, but a quiet understanding of grief. Unlike the itinerant photographers who offered memorial work as an afterthought, Mueller specialized in it. He moved gently among the bereaved, helping them preserve what time had taken. Clergymen and undertakers across eastern Iowa referred mourning families to him, trusting his rare combination of skill and compassion. Among the ledgers preserved in the archives, Dr. Morrison found his records, detailed notes that opened a small window into the Whitmans' private sorrow. An entry dated August 24, 1878, just one day after Emma's passing, recorded Mueller's first visit to the Whitman farm. There, following the solemn rituals of Victorian post-mortem photography, he prepared the child for her final portrait. His technical notes spoke of extraordinary care. He had used both natural light and carefully positioned oil lamps to create warmth and depth. He had adjusted the angles of her small hands, arranged folds of her white dress, and softened shadows around her face to achieve the illusion of rest. 3 weeks later, on September 15th, he returned to the same farmhouse. This time it was Mary and Samuel who sat before the camera, dressed in their best, trying to hold still beneath the weight of their parents' grief. Mueller spent hours studying the light in the room, matching its direction and tone to that of the earlier image of Emma. Every detail, the tilt of a head, the line of a shoulder, the fall of fabric was chosen to ensure that the three siblings would appear united. When the exposures were finished, Mueller returned to his small studio in Cedar Rapids. They are surrounded by chemical bottles, glass negatives, and the faint scent of collodion. He began the painstaking work of combining the images. Each plate was carefully aligned. Shadows were adjusted until they seemed to breathe the same air. It was a process that demanded not just skill, but reverence. Nearly a month after that first visit, the finished portrait was delivered to the Whitman farm, a single seamless image of 3 children together. The living and the dead, bound quietly in silver and paper, a family made whole again, if only through the fragile alchemy of light. The Whitmans had spared no cost in their effort to keep their family whole, even if only in memory. Albert Mueller's fee of $25, the equivalent of nearly $600 today, was a heavy sum for any farming household in 1878. Yet for Jonathan and Sarah Whitman, it was not a question of money. It was a question of love. A final act of care for their youngest child and a way to preserve the fragile illusion of togetherness that death had stolen. As Dr. Morrison continued her research, she realized that Emma's story was not an isolated tragedy. It was one thread in a tapestry of sorrow that had blanketed Cedar County that summer. The deeper she read, through old church registers and brittle pages of community ledgers, the more she uncovered a pattern of quiet devastation. In the records of the Liberty Township Methodist Church, where the Whitmans were devoted members, she found the trembling handwriting of Pastor David Williams, who had kept a meticulous journal of those grim months. Between July and September of 1878, he recorded the deaths of 11 children. Their ages ranged from 6 months to 12 years. All were listed as victims of the fever that has brought such sorrow to our community. The epidemic, it seemed, had begun in late June, perhaps brought by a traveler or carried silently in a shared well during that hot, airless summer. Whatever its origin, it spread swiftly through the close-knit farms, and no family was truly safe in a world without germ theory, where medicine was more faith than science. Families could do little but pray and endure. Mothers watched helplessly as their children weakened. Fathers rode miles through dust roads, searching for doctors who could offer no cure. And when the small coffins were built and the church bells tolled, the grief did not stop at the edge of any one farm. It moved from door to door until the entire township seemed to mourn as one. Dr. Morrison found something quietly beautiful in how the community had responded. In the records of that same church, she discovered notes about a bereavement fund, a collection organized by the congregation to help stricken families afford both funerals and memorial portraits. Neighbors gave what they could, coins, flour, a portion of a harvest, so that even the poorest among them could have one lasting image of the child they had lost. And so in those dark months, the photographers became silent witnesses to love and grief alike. The memorial portraits they created were more than mementos. They were proof. Proof that these children had lived, had been cherished, had mattered. In a time when so many died so young, these images were a defiant refusal to let memory fade. For some families, the portraits also had a practical purpose. Many in the township could not read or write, and a photograph could speak across generations in ways that words could not. It could be sent to relatives in distant states, a visual whisper of remembrance, or passed down through time, ensuring that a lost child's face was never entirely erased. For the Whitmans, that photograph of Mary Samuel and Emma had become exactly that, a testament to unity. A way to say, we were three. They had chosen not to hide their sorrow, but to fold Emma's memory into their family's story forever. Dr. Morrison began to see the larger picture that these memorial portraits were not merely acts of mourning, but of defiance. Communities ravaged by loss found in them a way to hold on to hope, to dignity, to each other. To understand what had claimed so many young lives, Dr. Morrison sought the help of Dr. Sarah Martinez, a historical epidemiologist. Together, they combed through coroner's ledgers, doctor's notes, and faded clippings from the Cedar Rapids Gazette. What emerged was heartbreakingly familiar, the pattern of a typhoid fever outbreak. The disease spread through contaminated wells, and cisterns thrived in that year's unusual heat and drought. Without proper sanitation, even the purest-looking water could carry death. Typhoid began with a fever, then headaches, weakness, delirium, and for too many children, an end that came before dawn. Dr. Martinez explained that the young were the most vulnerable, their bodies too fragile to withstand the infection. And on the wide, isolated farms of Cedar County, once one well was poisoned, the next would follow. In that summer of 1878, the prairie had bloomed under the sun, and beneath it a quiet plague had spread. The bacteria that carried typhoid could linger in water for weeks, quietly invisibly spreading from one well to the next before anyone truly understood what was happening. In 1878, such knowledge was still out of reach, and in the farming fields of Liberty Township, the people learned of it only through grief. The only physician for miles, Dr. Edmund Harrison, kept careful notes of the epidemic that swept through his community that year. Those notes, preserved in the archives of the Iowa Medical Society, read almost like confessions of effort, of failure, and of helplessness. His treatments were all that medicine could offer in that time: cold baths to fight the fever purgatives, to cleanse the body, and patent medicines that promised relief but rarely brought any. In truth, they may have worsened the suffering. Emma Whitman's name appears among those notes. For nearly 2 weeks, she fought the illness, burning with fever, crying out with pain, her small body racked with exhaustion. Her parents, Jonathan and Sarah, did all they could, and Dr. Harrison came when he could. But in the late hours of August 23, 1878, the fever claimed her. When autumn's cool air finally returned, the epidemic faded just as quietly as it had come. It wasn't medicine that saved the township, only time and the cold hand of the changing season. Yet something else was born in that moment, a portrait. The Whitman family memorial photograph was more than a technical experiment. It was a statement of defiance against loss itself. In that age, death was ever present, a constant neighbor at the edge of every farm. But families like the Whitmans refused to let it take their loved ones entirely. Through the strange, careful art of memorial photography, they preserved what the earth had claimed. Emma's image joined with her living siblings. Mary and Samuel became an act of remembrance and of resistance. To remove her would have been to accept the silence her death left behind. Instead, her parents asked the photographer to keep her within the frame, frozen in the stillness of a child who looked merely asleep. Dr. Morrison, while studying the family, found that the portrait had hung in the Whitman parlor for decades. It was the first thing visitors saw when they entered. There it watched over dinners, prayers, birthdays, an ever-present reminder that love could survive where life could not. For the surviving children, it became something more than memory. It was proof. Proof that Emma was still theirs, still part of the family story. They could look at that photograph and feel, if only for a moment, that the three of them were together again. In the late Victorian years, such portraits were not uncommon. Magazines and church publications even encouraged them, urging grieving parents to create physical symbols of their devotion, so their mourning would be seen as proper, moral, and enduring. And so while the Whitmans' investment in such a photograph might seem extravagant for a humble farming family, it carried deep meaning. In a world where letters took weeks to travel and families were scattered across distant states, a single image could hold the whole of one's love and carry it forward through time. Tell me, if you had lived then and you'd lost someone you loved, would you have done the same? Would you have wanted their face to remain beside yours, even when their breath had gone? The photograph could be reproduced and mailed across the miles, folded carefully into envelopes that carried both ink and grief. For relatives who had never met Emma Whitman, it was the only way to know her face to feel her presence within the tapestry of family memory. And in that quiet, fragile act, the Whitmans declared something profound. Death would not erase their daughter's place among them. They would keep her close, even if the world had taken her away. Dr. Morrison's research had reached its most delicate point when she uncovered proof, tangible written proof of which Whitman child had died. Until then, it had been theory and intuition. But what she found next transformed whispers into truth. In a dusty archive at the German-American Heritage Museum in Cedar Rapids lay the long-forgotten papers of the photographer Albert Miller, the man whose art had captured grief in silver and shadow. His descendants had donated every ledger, every letter. And within those yellowing pages, Dr. Morrison discovered a letter dated October 1878. In it, Miller wrote to his brother in Germany, "The loss of the youngest child has shattered this family. The mother cannot bear to look upon the child's body. Yet, she insists that Emma must appear in the family portrait alongside her brother and sister. I have never undertaken such difficult work, but their grief compels me to try." The words penned nearly a century and a half ago trembled with empathy. Miller went on to describe the delicate process, the multiple exposures, the precise lighting, the fragile balance of shadow and softness that allowed Emma's image to blend seamlessly with that of her living siblings. It was not merely photography, it was resurrection rendered in silver nitrate. Months later, Miller wrote again, this time to the Whitmans. He hoped, he said, that the portrait had brought them peace. Sarah Whitman's reply, preserved carefully with his letter, offered a window into the family's sorrow and solace. "Your wonderful work has given us comfort," she wrote. "When visitors see our family portrait, they say how peaceful all three of our children look. Emma seems only to be resting, and we sometimes imagine she might open her eyes and smile at us again. Mary and Samuel speak to her as though she was still with us." Her words revealed everything. That this photograph born of grief had become a bridge between life and death. Through Muller's skill, the Whitmans could continue to believe, if only for a heartbeat, that Emma was still there, still laughing, still watching over them. The illusion was perfect. The love even more so. More than 140 years later, that same portrait rests in a museum archive, its soft tones unchanged by time. Dr. Morrison's investigation had turned what once seemed a simple family photograph into something much deeper, a fragile doorway into the emotional world of 19th century America. It spoke not only of the Whitmans' heartbreak, but of an entire generation's struggle to make peace with death. In an age when loss was constant and cruel, families learned to fold their sorrow into their daily lives, to live alongside it, rather than deny it. Photographer Albert Miller, with his blend of artistry and compassion, gave those families something no priest or doctor could: the illusion of continuity. The chance to see, even just for a moment, the faces they could no longer touch. Dr. Morrison's study also uncovered how communities themselves rallied to soften the edges of such tragedies. Neighbors shared food, donated money, even helped one another commission portraits like the Whitmans. The act of remembering became collective, a shared resistance against the erasure that time demanded. And so the Whitman portrait endured both as artifact and as symbol. It became a teaching piece in museums, a silent reminder of how people once faced the unthinkable with grace, faith, and a photographer's gentle lens. Look at it now, and you might see just 3 children posing stiffly in a long ago parlor. But if you linger a moment longer, if you let your eyes rest on Emma's faint, serene smile, you might feel what the Whitmans once felt, that she is still there, quietly breathing within the photograph's stillness. And perhaps even now she is, because some love, some grief refuses to fade, no matter how many years pass or how many times the light touches the glass.